Let's bring in our guest who's been watching very closely the developments at the union buildings. Omogolo Taunyane is the founder and executive director of GBV Monitor South Africa. Of course, as the name suggests, she watches very closely our ability or lack thereof, Omogolo, to fight gender-based violence in the country. You've been amongst the many organizations that have been incredibly vocal about ways through which South Africa falls short when it comes to, in fact, pushing back against gender-based violence and femicide in the country. How confident are you feeling now that this bill has been signed into law?
Good morning, Ayanda, and thank you for having me, to your listeners as well. This is a very important step that the president has now taken, a much long-awaited development and a necessary one, because you will know that it was in 2020 when this National Council for GBVF was initially announced, and there was a call for nominations for that, and it was abandoned. So what we are now looking forward to, now that we have this bill that has been enacted, is that serious action will now be taken from a multi-sectoral approach, as the president has already mentioned, to start coordinating efforts that can accelerate how we can prevent and reduce gender-based violence.
Yeah. Help us understand the work that this council is expected to do at the very least. And I appreciate that perhaps some of that is still to be ironed out once, the council itself has been constituted. But generally speaking, what kind of practical work was hoped this council would actually be able to carry out?
Right. So what we imagine as civil society is that a council would be, as the president has mentioned, multi-sectoral, include labor, include civil society actors, include corporate in terms of the private sector, and include the government. And while we don't know the composition in terms of who the individuals would be and how big it would be, what we now know is that this particular council will be tasked with looking at the pillars from the National Strategic Plan on gender-based violence and saying these are the steps that we should be taking in order to say we are now serious and showing our commitment to ending gender-based violence. And what do we mean when we say that? We know that one of the pillars that the NSP already has, pillar 6, looks at research and information. Research is a very important part in terms of data collection, to saying what is SABC currently doing in terms of the processes on collecting data on cases on gender-based violence against victims and survivors. We have the National Prosecuting Authority. The president already announced and spoke about this, that conviction is an important part of ensuring that justice is realized for victims and survivors. We also know that the conviction rate in the country is very low, only 8%. Now the council is tasked with this work to hold the NPA accountable, to say, where are the gaps that are enabling this status quo to continue? And what is it that we should be doing? So it's a very big and long conversation that we can have. I think we need more time for it. But we are just looking forward to seeing how this council will be composed and exactly what that mandate will be once it is constituted.
Absolutely. It certainly is a mammoth task. And sometimes the risk that comes with that is that, things never really get off the ground, because we're not sure how many, people are going to be part of this council, how long the term will be, how much funding, quite frankly, the council is able to get. Sometimes the risk that comes with all of those many unanswered questions is that things kind of end with this very great grand gesture of the president publicly signing the bill. But, the situation on the ground doesn't change much. Hopefully, of course, that doesn't happen.
Correct. A very important point that you're making. Funding. Without funding, there really isn't anything that this council will achieve. The president has already announced now that it is 21 billion rand that is earmarked over a medium-term period to funding this particular council. But we know that pronouncements and action are two completely different scenarios. We have the example of the GBV-F Response Fund, which was also launched by the president, where he committed 1 billion rand. But we know that in reality, that particular organization only had 68 million rand that was allocated to it from private sector fundraising. We know that we have the Women's Economic Assembly. That's also an important step that government took to demonstrate that they're taking gender-based violence seriously. We know that there's the Tutuzela Care Center expansion plan, which is so important in making access to health services, psychosocial services, justice services accessible in communities. So it's a mammoth task, a one that we can't expect to happen immediately in terms of the changes that we are looking for. The bill is the first step, and now that it's a law, it is the first step to starting that process. And when the president speaks about a medium term, we are not looking at something that, we'll start seeing the change next month. We're looking at 5 to 10 years' time. And that is okay. We are saying that as long as that change really transforms our community, then the timelines are open to be negotiated in terms of what we are looking for from where we are and the change that we imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as the saying goes, the best time to have started maybe was a decade ago. The second best time to start is now. And that's certainly, I suppose, the sentiment that you're expressing as we watch this public signing and, in fact, the implications that unfold. What's also important, Omogolo, of course, is to try to take stock of whether or not, even just at a psychological level, we are getting a better sense of why, South Africans, in many respects, become so violent and how that materializes in gender-based violence. I mean, the president made the point there that, in some instances, this kind of violence is meted out against the victims in the intimacy of their homes. We know victims of the scourge are typically known to their perpetrators. And whilst there are laws that hopefully bolster our ability to respond to this, I wonder whether psychologically and in public discourse, you reckon we even are getting a better understanding of why specifically people become so violent in their homes?
It is an interesting question. And I would just like to bring to the attention of South Africans that we are generally living in a very violent country. And women, in this particular case, when you're talking about intimate partner violence, non-intimate partner violence, rape, murder, assault, are most affected by this. And not just women, we're talking about queer people, we're talking about children as well. But what we are saying is that we need social behavioral change programs. The point that you just made about the places where these crimes take place the most, it is in private places, it is in the homes of victims and survivors, or it is in places that they are familiar with, so perhaps a resident of the perpetrator. So that is already an indicator that these are people who are known to victims and survivors. The other area where these incidents take place are in public areas, parks, abandoned buildings, and then the other area where these incidents also take place are at universities. We also know that it's at workplaces and in public transport systems, taverns, liquor outlets, clubs, and bars. Now, this is an opportunity for the government to say, these are the target areas, priority areas, where we should be looking at awareness programs, where we should start talking about what we mean when we say positive masculinities and really building these positive masculinities. In feminist circles, you'll hear that women talk about toxic masculinity. We at GBV Monitor refer to it as a crisis of masculinity. These issues can be resolved and they can be fixed, but we need to start targeting young men, boys, to teach what appropriate and inappropriate behavior is in terms of boundaries and how they should be conducting themselves around women. Yeah. So social behavioral change programs, an important part, Second area, prosecutions. Third area, to ensure that we have a responsive SABC, so that women know that they have confidence in the system. They can come forward and go to a police station and know that once they have reported, the crime will be brought to book and someone will be held accountable for it.
Most certainly. It is a multi-layered problem. I think nobody has ever denied that, but today hopefully marks an important step in trying to get that problem finally sorted out in our country. Omogolo Taunyane, great speaking to you as always. We appreciate your time on the SABC. Omogolo is the founder and executive director of GBV Monitor South Africa.